It was the autumn of 1987, a damp Tuesday evening when the air carried the faint scent of rain and fallen leaves. The streets of Milford, a small town tucked between rolling hills and silent forests, were unusually quiet. Street lamps flickered against the creeping fog, their pale light catching on the slick pavement. Somewhere on the edge of town, a red brick school stood abandoned, its windows boarded, its playground overgrown with weeds that swayed in the night breeze. Inside that decaying shell beneath the cracked tiles and rusted pipes was the basement, sealed by a heavy metal door no one had dared to open in decap. The last time it was touched, people still carried cassette players, and the children who once filled the classrooms were now grown, scattered far from the place they had once called their own. That night, the caretaker's flashlight beam swept across the corridor, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. He paused, listening. The building groaned with the sound of settling wood and distant dripping water, but then something else, faint, rhythmic tapping. 3 beats, a pause, then again. It came from behind the locked door. No one had been down there in 20 years, no one was supposed to be. Yet here it was, an invitation or perhaps a warning, echoing through the concrete silence. By morning the sound would stop. But by then, one person in Milford would already be gone, and for 2 long decades no one would know why. Before the night of the disappearance, Thomas Reed had been the kind of man everyone in Milford recognized, even if they didn't know him well. In his early 40s, with a weathered face and the calm, deliberate movements of someone used to working with his hands, he had spent most of his life as the school's maintenance worker. People remembered seeing him walking to the old building at dawn, a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand, his tool belt slung over his shoulder. He lived alone in a small house just 3 blocks away, the paint on the porch peeling but the garden neat, always lined with marigolds in the summer. Thomas wasn't loud or particularly social, but he had a quiet kindness that made people trust him. On weekends, he could sometimes be found at the local diner, sitting at the corner booth with a folded newspaper, nodding to passers-by but never intruding on their conversations. Children remembered him for fixing their bikes or tightening the loose bolts on the swings in the playground without being asked. The old school, though abandoned, was his responsibility, at least in his eyes. He still checked its locks, swept the entryway, and kept the wild ivy from climbing over the front door. In the weeks leading up to that October evening, there had been small changes in his routine. The neighbors noticed the light in his workshop staying on much later than usual. At the diner, he sat staring out the window longer, letting his coffee go cold. Once, when asked if he was all right, he gave a faint smile and replied, "Some things you can't just let go." He never explained what he meant. There was also the key, an old, brass one with a worn, faded tag that he had started carrying on a separate chain around his neck. No one had seen it before. When someone jokingly asked if it was for a secret room, Thomas's expression turned briefly unreadable before he changed the subject. These little details didn't seem important at the time, but in the years that followed they would haunt the people who remembered them as if the clue had been sitting in plain sight all along. It was subtle at first, small ripples in the calm routine Thomas had kept for years. His neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, recalled seeing him standing on his porch late one night, long after the town had gone quiet, just staring toward the direction of the school. When she greeted him the next morning, he seemed distracted, as if he hadn't slept. At the diner, people began to notice that he no longer lingered over the sports section of the paper. Instead, he would trace his fingers along the rim of his coffee cup, eyes distant, lips moving as if he were silently rehearsing something. One afternoon, he was overheard speaking to the postman, muttering, "It's still there, I can hear it sometimes." The postman thought he was talking about an animal trapped in the building, but Thomas didn't explain. A week later, 2 teenagers swore they saw him at the edge of the school property after dark, holding a flashlight, standing perfectly still, his beam fixed on the basement windows. They called out to him, but he didn't respond, just turned and walked away without a word. Then there was the smell. Thomas mentioned it once to a former colleague, saying the basement carried a scent like damp earth but sharper, almost metallic. The man laughed it off, but Thomas's face remained grave. He also began avoiding certain people. He skipped his usual visits to the hardware store, and when the librarian stopped by to return a wrench she had borrowed, he didn't invite her in. Onel. Why spoke through the screen door, his voice low. Looking back, the signs were there, his unease, his late-night visits, the cryptic comments. But in Milford, where life moved at a slow, predictable pace, it was easy to dismiss these as quirks, the harmless habits of a solitary man. No one realized then that each of these moments was a fragment of a much larger warning, one that no one was prepared to hear. It was the evening of October 14, 1987, just after 9:30. The rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the empty streets. A cold wind carried the smell of wet asphalt and wood smoke from chimneys. Across town, most windows were already dark, but a faint glow still spilled from the small lamp in Thomas Reed's kitchen. He had been seen only an hour earlier at the corner store, buying a pack of batteries and a thermos of coffee. The cashier remembered him glancing out the window twice before leaving, as though making sure no one was watching. By 10 o'clock, he was walking toward the old school, his coat collar turned up, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the mist. A neighbor, Mr. Grayson, who lived on the opposite street, spotted him from his upstairs window. He said Thomas never looked up, never noticed the figure watching him, just kept moving with a steady, almost determined pace. The sound of the rain grew louder against the school's tin roof as he disappeared inside. The last confirmed sighting came from a passing patrol officer, who saw a light flickering through the cracked blinds of the ground floor office. The officer assumed it was just Thomas checking the property again, nothing unusual, nothing worth stopping for. But at 11:07, a faint, muffled noise echoed from somewhere deep within the school, 3 dull bangs, then silence. No one outside heard them except for a boy walking his dog along the far side of the fence. He later said it sounded like metal being struck slowly, deliberately. Moments later, the light in the office window went out. No one saw Thomas leave. By morning, his kitchen lamp still burned, his jacket still hung on its hook, and the thermos of coffee sat untouched on the counter. The school was locked as it always had been, the key he wore around his neck was gone. The search for Thomas began almost immediately after his absence was noticed. When he didn't show up for his usual morning check-in at the diner, Mrs. Callahan walked over to his house, expecting to find him asleep or working in his shed. Instead, she found the front door unlocked, the kitchen lamp still burning from the night before, and his coffee sitting cold on the counter. She called the sheriff's office before noon. By early afternoon, 2 deputies and the town's volunteer fire crew were gathered outside the old school, rain slickers pulled tight against the driz. They started with the obvious, checking the classrooms, the hallways, the gym. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and rust. The dust on the floors showed no fresh footprints, at least not where they expected to see them. When they reached the basement stairs, the heavy door at the top was locked, none of the keys in the school's storage worked. Sheriff Davis ordered the hinges removed, and the door was pried open with a crowbar. The basement was darker than they imagined, the beam of their flashlights swallowed by the damp air. They found nothing, no sign of Thomas, no tools, no clothing, not even his flashlight. Still, the search widened. By nightfall, neighbors had joined in, walking through the overgrown playground, scanning the wooded edge of the property, calling his name into the W. At Air, the next day, state police arrived with tracking dogs. The animals led them around the perimeter of the school but stopped abruptly near the eastern wall, sniffing the ground before sitting down, confused. No scent trail continued beyond that point. Divers were brought in to search the shallow creek behind the property, but they found only debris, rusted cans, broken glass, a single leather shoe. It didn't belong to Thomas. Rumors began almost immediately. Some whispered he'd run off, though no one could explain why. Others suggested he had discovered something in the basement he wasn't meant to find. By the end of the week, the only thing certain was that Thomas Reed had stepped into the old school that rainy night and vanished, leaving behind no more than the faint echo of those three strange bangs. Days turned into weeks, and the initial urgency of the search began to dull, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The school stood as it always had, silent, hulking against the gray sky, while the trail to Thomas seemed to dissolve into thin air. Every lead that had once felt promising fell apart under scrutiny. A supposed sighting of him at a bus station 2 towns over turned out to be a traveling salesman with the same build. A scrap of fabric found snagged on the fence was tested, only to reveal it belonged to an old curtain from one of the classrooms. The deputies kept combing through the building, convinced they must have overlooked something. Sheriff Davis admitted in private to one of his men that the place felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. Even the dogs refused to enter the basement again after the first search. One of the handlers swore the animals became agitated near the eastern wall, whining until they were led back outside. The townspeople grew restless. At the diner, whispers turned into quiet arguments, some claiming Thomas had been hiding secrets all along, others defending his character fiercely. Mrs. Callahan, who had known him for over 20 years, stopped eating there altogether after overhearing 2 men suggest he might have staged his own disappearance. By the 3rd month, the case file was a stack of dead ends. The sheriff's office had exhausted its overtime budget, and winter was closing in. Snow dusted the schoolyard, covering the footprints of the last search party. The state police pulled out, leaving only the local deputies to follow up on the occasional, half-hearted tip. For those who cared about Thomas, it was like watching a candle burn down to its last flicker. The unanswered questions gnawed at them, but there was nothing left to chase, no trail, no noise from the basement, no sign of life. Just an empty building at the edge of town, and a locked door that had gone quiet again. It was nearly 18 years later when the first real lead surfaced, long after most people in Milford had stopped speaking Thomas Reed's name aloud. The school had remained locked and untouched, its windows sealed, its yard a tangle of weeds and broken asphalt. Then, in the summer of 2005, a small construction crew was hired to clear the lot for a proposed community center. On the second day of work, while removing debris from the eastern side of the building, one of the laborers, a man named Carlos Mendez, found something. Wedged between the foundation stones, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a key. Not just any key, but an old brass one on a rusted chain, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. The tag was barely legible, the letters and numbers rubbed almost flat, but under the right light you could just make out 2 words: Basement East. Carlos mentioned it to his foreman, who at first shrugged it off, assuming it belonged to an old storage closet. But later that evening, when word reached the sheriff's office, it caught the attention of Deputy Ellen Hart, who had been a rookie the year Thomas vanished. She still remembered the way he used to wear a similar key around his neck. The key was sent for testing, but time and exposure had erased any fingerprints. Even so, the find stirred something in the community, a quiet ripple of unease. If it had been sitting outside the foundation all these years, how had no one seen it before? And if it belonged to Thomas, why was it outside the school at all? For Deputy Hart, the discovery was enough to reopen the file. She went back through the old reports, retracing the steps of the original search, marking the eastern wall where the dogs had once stopped and refused. To go further, the more she read, the less the key felt like a coincidence. It felt placed as though someone wanted it to be found, but only after a very long wait. And that thought brought her to a decision she had avoided for nearly 2 decades: the locked basement door would have to be opened again. On a gray morning in late September 2005, the town gathered in small, curious knots along the sidewalk outside the old school. The air was heavy with that stillness before rain, the clouds pressed low over the roofline. Deputy Ellen Hart stood at the front steps, the brass key in her hand, its weight far greater than the metal itself. 2 officers from the county were with her, along with a locksmith and a crime scene photographer. Inside, the air was colder than expected, damp and stale. Their footsteps echoed down the hall, dust drifting in thin clouds with each movement. When they reached the basement door, Ellen paused, pressing her fingers lightly against the worn handle. For a moment, she swore she heard something on the other side, so faint she couldn't decide if it was real or just her own pulse in her ears. She slid the key into the lock, it resisted, then turned with a reluctant click. The door groaned open, releasing a wave of air so stale it seemed to have been trapped for decades. The flashlight beams cut into the darkness, revealing cracked concrete walls, pipes running low overhead, and pools of water along the floor. The smell was stronger now, damp earth and something metallic beneath it. They stepped carefully, the sound of water dripping somewhere ahead. Then the light caught on something near the far wall. It was a wooden chair toppled on its side, one leg broken. Beside it lay a flashlight, corroded but intact, and a thermos still sealed shut. Ellen crouched, brushing away the thin film of grime from the thermos lid. Her chest tightened. It was the same deep green model Thomas had bought the night he vanished. As they moved deeper, they found an irregular patch in the concrete floor, a section that looked newer than the rest. The county officers exchanged a glance. Within the hour, a crew arrived with tools to break it open. The sound of metal striking stone echoed in the confined space, sharp and jarring. When the last slab was lifted, the air changed, colder, heavier. What they found beneath was not a body, not in the way anyone expected. It was a narrow crawlspace, and in it, an old canvas bag, its contents wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, the pages warped with age but still legible. The first one Ellen opened began with a date, October 3, 1968, nearly 20 years before Thomas disappeared. The words inside spoke of noises in the basement, of locked doors, of things that should never have been found. And on the final page, scrawled in hurried ink, a single line: "It's not the building, it's what's under it." The discovery of the notebooks changed everything. What had been a cold missing persons case now carried the weight of something older, stranger, and far more unsettling. For weeks, Deputy Ellen Hart worked with county investigators to catalog every page, photographing and preserving them before the fragile paper cowl. Decrumble. The earliest entries described maintenance logs, mundane notes about plumbing repairs, and inventory checks from a man named Harold Finch, the school's caretaker in the late 1960s, but slowly the tone shifted. Finch began recording strange sounds, scratching, rhythmic tapping, and faint voices, always at night, always from the eastern side of the basement. By 1970, his notes turned fearful. He wrote about finding the heavy door ajar when it should have been locked, about discovering muddy footprints leading from the crawlspace to the main hall, and about the smell, earthy, metallic, just as Thomas had described decades later. One entry, dated November 12, 1971, mentioned a hollow in the foundation and an order from the school board to seal it without explanation. Finch hinted that someone in authority wanted whatever was beneath the school to stay hidden. The later notebooks, the ones from the 1980s, were different. They weren't written by Finch at all, but by Thomas. No one knew he had even kept journals. His entries mirrored Finch's earlier ones: strange noises, the smell, the shifting of objects in locked rooms. But toward the end, his handwriting grew erratic. He wrote about feeling watched, about dreams of the basement door swinging open, and about finding the key to the crawlspace buried in the dirt outside. The eastern wall. His final entry was dated the night he vanished: "Going down there tonight. If I don't come back, it's still there." The public reaction was swift. The story ran in the local paper, then was picked up by regional news outlets. Some saw the notebooks as proof of something supernatural. Others dismissed them as the paranoid ramblings of two men who had spent too much time in a decaying building. But for those who had known Thomas, the details felt too precise to ignore. The school was deemed unsafe and the demolition fast-tracked. The foundation would be torn up entirely, though some argued it should be left untouched. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, Thomas Reed's name was on everyone's lips again, not as a man who simply vanished but as someone who why have uncovered a truth that had been buried beneath Milford for generations. When the demolition began in the spring of 2006, the entire eastern wing of the old school was stripped to its foundation. Heavy machinery tore through concrete and brick, sending dust swirling into the pale morning air. The workers moved methodically, but there was an unspoken tension among them. Most had heard the stories by now. By the third week, they reached the section directly above the crawlspace where the notebooks had been found. That's when they stopped. Beneath the broken slabs, the soil was darker, damp even after weeks without rain. It had a strange metallic tang that clung to the air. A small chamber was uncovered, no bigger than a storage closet, its walls rough and uneven as though they had been carved out by hand. Inside, there was nothing but the remnants of a wooden box, rotted nearly to dust, and a scattering of small objects that no one could identify at first. Sent shapes like coins but with no markings, made from a metal no one recognized. The county sent them to a lab, but the results were inconclusive. They weren't currency, they weren't any alloy used in modern construction. Officially, they became unclassified metallic artifacts. Unofficially, they became the fuel for a dozen new theories. The chamber was sealed off after documentation, the debris carted away. By summer, the school was gone entirely, replaced by a flat expanse of gravel and grass seed. The town moved on, at least on the surface. But for those who had stood at the fence and watched the excavation, the memory of that smell and the cold air rising from the earth never left. Deputy Ellen Hart kept one of Thomas's notebooks locked in her desk drawer, the one with his final entry. She read it from time to time, not because she expected it to give her answers, but because it reminded her of the man the town had lost, someone who something worth risking everything to understand. The questions lingered, stubborn as the roots beneath the soil. What had been buried under the school before the first brick was ever laid? Why had two men, decades apart, heard the same sounds and felt the same pull toward that door? And the one question no one could shake, if Thomas had found what he was looking for, why had he never come back to tell them? Some people in town still say the school was just a building, and that the stories are nothing more than the kind of tales small places invent to keep themselves interesting. But others, the ones who stood close enough to feel that chill from the open chamber, swear there was something else down there, something older than school, older than the town itself, and maybe that's why Thomas went missing. Maybe he wasn't lost at all, maybe he found exactly what he was looking for. The field where the school once stood is quiet now. Kids ride their bikes past it without knowing the ground they're crossing has swallowed two people whole. The grass has grown over, but anyone who stops long enough will notice that the soil still dips in strange, uneven patterns, as if something beneath is slowly shifting. We may never know what was behind that locked door or why it stayed sealed for 20 years. But I can't help wondering, if it was locked once, could it be locked again, and if so, what's keeping it shut this time? If you've ever heard of a place in your town with a door no one is supposed to open or a room no one talks about, tell me in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because some doors only stay closed when we stop looking for them.